Good to see you all this morning. And with Mike out of town, we're continuing in our series, The Search for Serenity. And today, as my friend Randy pointed out, it's a tough but a great topic today, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace. The Serenity prayer has become kind of the de facto prayer that was adopted many years ago by 12-step recovery groups like Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I've been familiar with this prayer in the short form for a lot of years, and I really appreciate that Mike does a series on this, because there's a lot of meat on that bone, as they say. Some great stuff in this long form, and I'm also grateful that Mike resurrected the original form of this, because there are some slight differences between the prayer that we're covering in this series versus the one that came along later. And the biggest deal is, instead of saying God grant me serenity, it says God give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. And another change is in the part we're doing today, because in the more modern version it says accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. In the original version it said as a pathway to peace. So the newer version kind of implies that the only path to peace is through hardship, and we could have a spirited debate on which one is more accurate, but I was taught that God always whispers before he shouts. And therefore, I think that a lot of the pain we suffer in life is kind of optional. And if we were to make better decisions early on, I think some pain definitely is avoidable. But again, this prayer, just like this prayer has been like the de facto prayer of AA, Amazing Grace was also adopted as kind of the de facto song of 12-step recovery. And even though there's no singing in 12-step recovery, I'm grateful for that, because I couldn't carry a tune if you put handles on it. But it reminds me, one time a friend of mine had a relative pass away, so I went to the funeral with him. And in the funeral, they sang Amazing Grace. So after the service, I went up to my friend and I go, I didn't know your uncle was an alcoholic. And he goes, what? He didn't even drink. And I go, but they sang Amazing Grace at his funeral. And he's just like, wow, dude. But this is just a great, great prayer. So it starts with a great question, too. What would we consider to be hardship? When we think of the term hardship, I'm sure that gets a lot of people's wheels turning. Because I personally think of hardship as anything that is difficult, anything that bogs me down, anything that causes me pain or problems. And there's a lot of, I love how Mike simplifies things. And the way that he simplifies our hardships of life is they all really fit in two camps. Either we suffer because we don't have what we want, or we do have what we don't want. If we could just go through life and add more of the things we want and get rid of the things we don't, life would be great, wouldn't it? But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that way. We have a lot of external problems with jobs, relationships, finances, health, things that break, and we also have internal problems. Things like we struggle with fear, depression, envy, weakness, resentment, jealousy, envy, lust. So there's a lot of conflicts we have in life. But the takeaway is that life is hard. I think that's a true statement. And but then we get into another deeper question. What would the Bible define as a hardship? And when we get into that, the ironic thing is, life is hard with or without God. In fact, even worse, according to the Bible, becoming a Christian seems to add more troubles in some cases. Well, that's not good news, is it? I mean, if this way of life, if Christianity adds more hardships, then that actually would make this opposed to us finding peace, wouldn't it? I mean, how do you have more peace, which is, I think, one of the goals of Christianity, when they're actually adding trouble? Now, it also is true that a spiritual way of life, in some respects, reduces the problems we have in this world. Because by making better decisions, moral decisions, if you will, we end up living a life that really is based in problem prevention. There's a lot of problems that I don't have because I live a way of life today where I'm just not creating all the drama and chaos that I used to in some respects. But it's still true that there's a lot of things that the Bible warns us are going to be hardships in our life. So it talks about things like persecution, sacrifice. It mentions separation and division. That part where Christ said, I did not come to bring peace but a sword. And he talks about sometimes if you get serious about God, it can actually be a source of division in families, division in certain relationships. I've known people where being vocal about their Christianity has caused problems for them in work and their careers. So there's a lot of ways that this Christian way of life of ours can actually make even harder going. And then it also alludes to other things, like in one passage it says that we all have our cross to bear. And then Paul talked about how he had a certain affliction that he called a thorn in the flesh. And so some things like that are kind of cryptic, aren't they? And personally, I'm glad that they're not rigidly defined, because by using general terms like that, I think it helps us all to relate to that. Like a thorn in the flesh. They've been debating that for 2,000 years on what exactly was wrong with Paul. And some people say it was some physical affliction with his eyes, and others say it was a group of people that followed him around and hounded him, and they just drove him crazy. And the more modern translation of thorn in the flesh, I think, is a pain in the butt. Did he just say that in church, Randy? See, I could have made it worse. But that we think of things that are just a pain. And I especially like that term that we all have our cross to bear, because that almost implies that some of our afflictions in this life are going to be very personal, targeted to us. But I've really come to appreciate that particular, I don't want to call it a warning, but a particular red flag, because when you think about the story of Christ, do you remember how he was forced to carry his own cross outside of town? The cross to Jesus, to his enemies, was designed to be an instrument of his death. Ironically, in God's hands, it became a miraculous instrument of life, not only leading to his personal resurrection, but also it was the vehicle through which we all were given the blessing of new life through that event, through what happened there. So when it says we all have our cross to bear, and you also remember the part of that story was Christ carried this cross until it exhausted him. And under the weight of this burden, he carried it as far as he could and collapsed. And at that point, remember what happened? Somebody came out of the crowd and relieved him of that burden and carried it with him through the rest of the rest of the journey. See, I believe that we all have some personal afflictions or addictions or just certain things that we have in our life that were designed by the forces of evil to defeat us, to bring us down. And I believe that we've all struggled with these things for years in some cases. And when we couldn't bear the weight of these anymore, and we finally collapsed under it, isn't it just true that somehow people have come alongside of us and relieved us of that burden and helped us to carry these things with us and for us so that we could get to a place where what was designed for us personally as an instrument of defeat, even an instrument of death, could be magically, miraculously transformed into an instrument of life for others. That's, I think, the story of addictions, where these, things like drug addiction or alcoholism or gambling addictions or whatever they are, eating disorders. These things can be fatal, and they're designed to defeat us, to kill us. But in God's hands, when we could not bear the burden of these things, people came alongside of us from seemingly sometimes out of nowhere. And they not only helped relieve us of that burden, but they led us to a place where those things in God's hands could be miraculously transformed, where they became the very vehicle through which we were given the power to help others. And I think that's beautiful how that goes. So when we have our cross to bear, it's not a permanent situation, but it's a means to a greater end. But the takeaway that I get when the Bible says that life is hard and can get harder even with our beliefs is it really brings us to the value of realistic expectations. Because there's a lot of churches and a lot of religions that tend to oversell Christianity. I fell into that myself early on because there were a lot of prosperity preachers on TV and a lot of ministries out there that taught a message that sounded great, very attractive. Because they were saying things like, God loves you and He wants you to be popular and wants you to be successful and wants you to be rich and He's going to give you all this stuff. And they painted this picture where if I'm doing it right, then the evidence of that is riches in this world, rewards in this world. And it was a very easy sell. And that's why that's great if you live on Easy Street, but I've noticed that Easy Street doesn't have a lot of traffic. There's not a lot of people there. And the other truth about living on Easy Street is you can only rent, you can't buy. Because sooner or later we all get evicted. You can't permanently stay there because sooner or later every human being is going to suffer something in life. It might be death itself, but we finally realize that we can visit there, but we can't live there. And that's why the Bible, on the other hand, is very honest in revealing that they say things like, in this world you will have trouble. Well, I don't want trouble, but hey, that's the reality. It says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. The Bible talks about our present sufferings. So, in an honest reveal like that, the takeaway is we come to have the value of realistic expectation. And because of that, we don't have disappointment. We don't have disillusionment because if we're getting our information from the Bible, we have no illusions to begin with. We have a reassurance that things are normal. See, sometimes I'll go to a doctor and what really gives me peace isn't that they're going to fix me, but it's just I need to know, is this normal? Like if they fix something, what can I expect realistically? And if he says, yeah, that's just normal pain for the condition you have, see, in that way, I get that comfortable reassurance that it's normal and not abnormal. And I think this all makes a lot more sense if we start to see God in terms of the great physician. See, I remember one time I went to the chiropractor because my shoulder was out. Anybody have their shoulder out right now? Don't raise your hand because you can't. Yeah, me. But if you've ever had your shoulder out, he gets ready to put this thing in, and, he tells me before he sets it, he says, "This is gonna hurt." And I don't always remember things right, but I'm pretty sure when he said this is gonna hurt, he did it in a Clint Eastwood voice. It's like, you're gonna go to sleep and then immediately wake up in a world of pain. Punk. And he weren't kidding. I mean, he sets that and it cracks like a rifle going off, and it hurt. But when he said this is gonna hurt, he didn't say the other part out loud. He implied it. But what he really was saying is this is going to hurt, and then it's going to start to heal. So the immediate pain gave way to a more subtle pain, but eventually that was not the pain of suffering, it was the pain of healing. My dad had stomach issues for many years, and my parents were older than most of my friends' grandparents. So if anybody wants to hear about the Great Depression, the dirty 30s, I'm your huckleberry, because I got stories to tell about. I've heard them all. But he had a lot of stomach problems when he was young, and that was all meatball surgery back in the 30s and 40s. So he had so many scars, his stomach looked like a railroad map of Chicago, and he needed another operation, but he hated the pain. He didn't want to do it. So for years, he'd have stomach issues, and we'd be having family dinner, and he had this big red bowl full of toast and milk. And we're eating meat and we're eating vegetables, and he's just toast and milk, and that was all he could stomach. But the pain, the immediate pain of having the operation followed by healing, he postponed. So for years, he just suffered with the pain of putting up with his condition. No hope of it getting better, and his solution was to just eat bland foods over and over. So it's kind of a pay me now or pay me later deal. Pick your pain, if you will. So, but with that, with understanding the reality of pain and having realistic expectations that it's unavoidable, it brings us to the real problem of pain. When I was new at this God stuff, some of the people that came alongside of me, what they gave me were books. And a lot of these books were written by a guy named C.S. Lewis. Anybody remember C.S. Lewis? Raise your hand. C.S. Lewis was brilliant. And he wrote things like Mere Christianity that answered questions I couldn't even ask right. And the Screwtape Letters, which were an old demon tutoring a young demon and how to mess with the heads of people like me. But one that has risen to the top is one of my all-time favorites, was a book that C.S. Lewis wrote called The Problem of Pain. Now, me digesting C.S. Lewis, because what he wrote was brilliant, but it was heavy, it was thick. And for me to digest C.S. Lewis was kind of like watching a puppy eating peanut butter. I mean, it's going down, but it's going down slow. But I got through this book of The Problem of Pain, and I loved it because what C.S. Lewis wrote is the real problem of pain is that it gives our lying lower nature an opportunity to deceive us about our conception of God. It strikes right at the roots of our faith because we begin to question our beliefs. We begin to look at God sideways. It's exactly the same trick that the serpent used in the Garden of Eden, where he cons Adam and Eve into questioning God's motives, and they start to look at him sideways, like, he's holding back on you. He doesn't want you to know, the good and evil, and, he's cheating you in this deal, and things like that, and it's the same process that we go through psychologically today. So we get down to that question, why? Why do I have to suffer? And unfortunately, when people try to explain suffering, they land in the book of Job, where he had all these friends trying to rationalize why Job was suffering. They didn't come to help him, did they? They just came to help try to make sense of it all. But the fact is, there's, the problem of pain is these lies that get in our heads, they tend to take one of two different angles. Because when we start questioning our conception of God, C.S. Lewis says the first lie that gets in our head is, since I'm suffering, it's because God is not great. The reason God isn't helping me is because he cannot. God can't help because he lacks the power. He lacks the ability to help me. So our conception of God in that case is he's standing there helpless with his pockets turned inside out and his hands are like this or like this, going, dude, I see your suffering, I see your pain, and I sympathize with you. Sucks to be you, but I feel bad, but I got nothing for you. In that case, like if you have financial problems, God, man, I'm a little flat myself. I was hoping you'd flip me a few bucks. Let me go a little heavier on that collection plate because I need a cheeseburger. But so we get this conception of God that he can't help. But even worse is the lie in our head is the reason that we're in pain is it's not that he can't help, it's that he could help us, but he will not because he lacks the motivation. He just does not care about us. And that makes God even worse, doesn't it? In that case, God's almost like an unloving sociopathic monster because instead of like this, he's like this. He's going, yeah, I see your pain. Yeah, and I could help. Just don't want to. I don't care. And in that case, we get deceived into this conception of God where he's not going to help us. So nobody who sees God as the problem can see him as the solution. And these are the lies in our head. So what is the answer for the problem of pain? And again, this is where I think C.S. Lewis knocked it out of the park because he found a solution in this in 2 words. You'll find these 2 words in the Lord's Prayer. Our true conception of God, our Father. The literal translation is our Abba, our Daddy. Our Daddy who art in heaven. So, God is a perfect parent. And a perfect parent who cares more about our long-term development rather than in our short-term comfort. God is a father. He's not a grandfather. See, if God was a grandfather, there would be ice cream. If God was a grandfather, there would be candy. If God was a grandfather, he would walk in front of us and drop silver dollars for us to find. But God is a father, and that means that as a father, he has a job to do. Today is Mother's Day, and we celebrate parents. And here's a great question for the mothers here, for the fathers here, if you have kids. If you are a parent, what is your number one job? Is your number one job to isolate your children from pain? Yes or no? See, if you believe that your main job as a parent, you had one job, if your job is simply to insulate your children from pain, you can do that. All you have to do is build a padded room in your basement, lock your kid in there for the first 25 years, and never let them out. They will never get a skinned knee. They will never get a broken heart. They will never get a tooth knocked out. But in insulating them from pain, you're also you're isolating them from reality, and you're isolating them from personal growth, and you're isolating them from having human interaction to comfort them in their times of need. So that is not how you raise healthy kids. Another question, if you're a job, is your number one job as a parent to give your kids everything they want? Again, no. You try to provide for their needs, but if you give them everything their little heart desires, what's the term for kids raised like that? Spoiled, rotten, entitled. And that's how you raise, very selfish kids that are, that just aren't prepared for life and reality. So, a loving God, his job is not to ignore our pain or even insulate us from our pain. It's to help us bear our pain, to walk with us every single step of the way. And he's there to help, but he's not always there to prevent it or to do it with us. If you're a good parent, do you want your kids to fall off a bicycle? No, you're not going to shove them off of it, but you want them to learn how to ride. So the same trip to the store where you go in and buy the first bike for your kid, you buy the training wheels, and you're not going to turn them loose, you're going to run beside them as they learn how to ride it. And then before you take the bike home, you go through pharmacy and buy the Band-Aids. Again, not because you want them to fall off, but it's part of the process, the painful process of learning. And you're willing to bear the brunt of that as much as you don't want to see them hurt. You're willing to let them take calculated risks and experience certain levels of pain for their long-term growth, their long-term development. And you see, that made sense to me. And so where else do we file hardship? And I think the other part of this is to realize that there is a purpose to our suffering. Because a lot of times, I can endure a lot, number one, if I know it's normal, but also if I know that it has purpose. I've never been a fan of needless suffering. But if it's a suffering as part of a process of growth, then I can accept that short-term sacrifice for the greater gain. And there's a great line, and if you read in the AA Big Book, there's a great couple of paragraphs buried in there in a chapter to wives that says, if you and your husband find a solution for the pressing problem of drink, you are, of course, going to be very happy. But all problems will not be solved at once. Seed has started to sprout in a new soil, but growth has only begun. In spite of your newfound happiness, there will be ups and downs. Many of the old problems will still be with you. This is as it should be. The faith and sincerity of both you and your husband will be put to the test. These workouts should be regarded as part of your education, for thus you will be learning how to live. You will make mistakes, but if you are in earnest, they will not drag you down. Instead, you will capitalize them. A better way of life will emerge when they are overcome. That's tight. I love that. But 3 concepts in 2 simple sentences buried in there. Tests, workouts, and education. When we encounter problems in life, or we encounter hardships, the first thing we need to say is, we wonder, well, is God testing me? I'm not sure if God tests us or if it's just the world's job to test us, but we tend to see tests as a negative thing. But not everybody does. If you're a great student, you think, yay, another day, another A. You love tests. If you're not a good student, it's like, another test, another F. But the purpose of testing is not to produce flunking or produce failure. You see, the real value of tests is they are given to demonstrate progress, to celebrate success, and to expose opportunities for further improvement. See, when I was building hot rods, we would put better parts on there and get things dialed in, and then we'd go torture test them. You'd run things past red line and bang gears too hard, but the whole reason you did torture testing was if that thing was going to blow up, you wanted it to happen in the testing phase and not when you're racing some guy down the track. I didn't say road. Highway. But if it wasn't going to hold together, you needed to know. And that was the purpose of testing, wasn't to blow it up, but it was to make sure it wasn't going to blow up. But if it was, you needed to know. So that's why testing turned out to be a good thing, because it exposes weaknesses that you need to know about. The second reason why we have some of these things, is that it also used the term workout. The value of workouts is through practice and repetition, we gain strength by overcoming resistance. See, gravity tries to make weights go one way, and you provide resistance by lifting them repetitively, and what happens? You build muscle. An airplane to fly, to overcome gravity, needs two things: power and opposition. It's the wind going under the wings that provide the lift. Without that opposition, it couldn't get off the ground. Planes could not fly in a vacuum. So we don't like resistance, but it's a necessary component of growth. And the final thing is the value of lessons. Because I was taught that morality and reality are the same thing. God's laws are not woo-woo-woo, they're purely practical. Because the more that we live the way that God instructs us to live, it is a method of problem prevention. We don't subconsciously sabotage ourselves by making bad decisions that bring us bad results. So, what we really need to learn through a process of trial and error is we're trying to work it out in our own heads. We need to learn what works and what doesn't work. And, that's why, as much as you tell a kid not to touch a hot stove, they're going to touch a hot stove, but hopefully once. And that should be the end of it, a tough lesson. And you don't want it to go that way, but it's kind of inevitable. I was also taught that if a cat sits on a hot stove, it'll never sit on another hot stove, but it also will never sit on a cold one either. So sometimes for every mile of highway, there's 2 miles of ditch. So sometimes we can overcorrect, but that's the third thing that we get. Because of the hardships, that's how they lead ultimately to peace. Because we can make good decisions, either listening to the whispers and going into it, or some of us back into it by backing away from the pain. But either way, it's the same journey. So this morning, we're going to wrap this up by celebrating communion. And as we do this as a community, we're going to kind of shift gears or turn this around. Because in celebrating communion, the Bible, according to Jesus, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And what we're going to focus on during our communion this morning, celebrating this is an opportunity to reflect upon the hardships that Jesus accepted on our behalf, so that he could create a pathway for us to find peace. So if he did it for us, then the admonition is for us to accept that humbly and to try and continue his work by doing things for others. So as we, the elements are in the back, and as we go back and collect the bread and the juice, we can collect those and come back, and then we'll just take those elements and close with a prayer. And as we take these elements, we will reflect upon the hardships that Christ suffered on our behalf. And I would just like to say what I would have to believe is the best prayer that I've ever prayed from up here. And it goes like this. God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Help us, Lord, to live one day at a time and to enjoy one moment at a time. Help us, Lord, to accept hardship as a pathway to peace. And let us take, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as we would have it be. Help us, Lord, to trust that you will make all things right if we surrender to your will, so that we may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen.